As we begin today, I want to remind you of the research paper. It is due on Thursday, so make sure to get that completed, get it turned in. You can turn it in, unless you've made arrangements with me. You can turn it in up to 2 days late, and you'll lose a letter grade every day. But if there's some reason, some legitimate reason why you cannot get it in this Thursday, talk to me about it. But otherwise, if you can't get it in Thursday, you do have a little bit of a cushion there to get it in. But make sure to get that in as soon as possible if you happen to miss Thursday's date, because again, it does lose quite a bit of points as the days go on. Today we are going to be focusing on the 19th century and issues related to culture and society. And I want to pick up looking at culture and society kind of where we left off last Wednesday. We weren't specifically in slavery. We talked about Native Americans is where we did finish up. But we were talking a lot about slavery. And so I want to focus, as we get started here, on kind of the Christian response to slavery in the North. In the South, a lot of Christians endeavored to find ways that they could approve of slavery or they could promote slavery from the Bible or from a Christian worldview. So finding passages in the Bible that talk about slaves obeying their masters, examples of Christian individuals who held people enslaved, yet were looked upon as faithful people, like Abraham. And then other types of things that Christians endeavored to do to try and make it clear that the biblical approach was to support slavery. Well, those in the North didn't always buy into those agreements and arguments and didn't support them either. But abolitionism, we should remember, slavery, we should remember in the 19th century, was not just an issue for the United States. There was still slavery in Great Britain as well. And Great Britain, recognized as a Christian nation also, a monarch, a member of the Church of England, the Church of England very tied to the government. And so there were British abolitionists as well, people like William Wilberforce, who was very active in the 18th century, but also into the 19th century. And we also talked in conjunction with Wilberforce of John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, who also worked for British abolition. Wilberforce was born into a wealthy family in the middle of the 18th century, and by the time he was in his 20s was a member of Parliament. Now, during this time, he also converted to an evangelical branch of Christianity. And connected with his religion was a belief that Christianity shouldn't just be about saving souls, it should be about social reform as well. Now, he wasn't the only one that believed this. In fact, in a little bit, we'll talk about how that attitude is spread throughout a lot of evangelicals, even in the United States. That Christianity shouldn't just have an impact on your life hereafter, but should have an impact on a person's life now, but also should be shaping society. Wilberforce was concerned about a lot of issues, and frequently donated sizable sums to charity. And so that was one of the things that was important. But slavery was the one that people most remember him for, and the one he was perhaps most active about. And so he becomes convinced that out of his Christian convictions, he should put all his effort into abolishing both the slave trade as well as slavery itself. He introduced bills in Parliament throughout the last part of the 18th century several times, trying to end the slave trade and trying to end slavery. And he was continually, and they were continually defeated. And often Wilberforce was mocked for his ideas. But finally, in 1807, Parliament voted to end the slave trade in Great Britain and its territories. It will be the next year before it's ended in the United States. Wilberforce died in 1833, shortly after a bill to abolish slavery had passed the House of Commons, which is one of the houses of the British Parliament. And so he dies shortly after he does see his dream beginning to be realized that slavery would end. Others, of course, John Newton, there are others we can talk about, but Wilberforce is probably the most recognized. And many of them involved in abolitionism, and many of those that did so came from Christian motives. Right? This was drawing from their religious beliefs. Across the pond, for our purposes, a lot of our focus sitting here in Alabama and the United States is what went on in the United States in the 19th century. And so there's a few individuals I want to talk about as well. Frederick Douglass, very important, very prominent in the 19th century for several reasons. First, because of his writing and his speaking, traveling quite a bit, but also because of his own personal story. Douglass was born a slave in Maryland in 1818, did not know who his father was, though he suspected that he was possibly the son of a white slave master. As a child, he did learn to read. He was taught how to read before he ended up as a teenager being sent to work in the fields. Now, it was illegal for slaves to learn to read. But he had gained enough knowledge from some favorable whites about reading, learning the alphabet, and some other things like that, that he was able then to kind of further educate himself. So it kind of started and then stopped formally, but then he continued to go on his own. Around the age of 20, he managed to escape to New York City and then moved to Massachusetts, where he changed his name to Douglass to avoid recapture. And so, people were looking for a different slave. They weren't looking for Frederick Douglass. And so it allows him to remain free because people are not looking for someone by that name. In the 1840s, he becomes very active in the abolitionist cause. Not that he wasn't concerned about abolition before then, but he's finally becoming very active now that he's into his 30s, and becomes a frequent speaker about the issue. In the middle of the 1840s, he publishes his autobiography called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And in the book, he reveals his slave name, he reveals a lot of his background, and because of that, he flees to the British Isles, certain that he will be tracked down and sent back to slavery. While in the British Isles, a lot of his British supporters, people that heard him speak, and of course Britain kind of already has abolitionism or had already abolished slavery, and so he has some British supporters that actually work to buy his freedom. And so he eventually returns back to the United States, where he starts a newspaper called the North Star, that it would later take other names. In his speaking and writing, there's kind of two things to recognize when we think of Christianity. One way was, Douglass's frequent criticism and really, his critique, and we could even say almost an attack on Christianity for its allowance of slavery as well as its support of slavery. So, for example, he says, the church and the slave prison stand next to each other. The church-going bell and the auctioneer's bell chime in with each other. The pulpit and the auctioneer's block stand in the same neighborhood. Right? And so this idea of, here we have these two institutions in the United States supporting each other, next to each other. But he also made a distinction between what he thought of as false Christianity and true Christianity. And he often termed this as the freedom of the slave, or the religion of the slave master and the religion of Christ. The slave master, he said, who beats his slaves, stands behind the pulpit on Sunday. People who destroyed slave relationships, either through sale or through forced sexual activity, destroyed these marriages and these families, and then preached on Sunday how important families were. Right? And so the hypocrisy of the religion of slave masters. He said, "We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members." But again, he contrasted that with what he saw of as true Christianity, or the religion of Christ. "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, except the most deceitful one, for calling the religion of this land Christianity." And so this kind of, people have taken Christianity and corrupted it. And so Christianity, he believes, supported peace, supported freedom. Another prominent abolitionist at the time, one very active with Douglass for a while, was William Lloyd Garrison. In the early years, Garrison grew up as a Christian, his Christianity kind of serving as the foundation for his denunciation of slavery. He would later kind of move from traditional Christianity. Garrison was born in Massachusetts, grew up in very poor conditions. His father left the family when he was young, and so there was a lot of poverty in Garrison's family, and eventually began working in journalism, doing a variety of things for newspapers and then writing himself. At the age of 25, he becomes very active in abolitionism. And by 1831, had developed his own anti-slavery paper known as the Liberator. And so he's kind of sticking his neck out, identifying himself, and publicly writing and speaking as well as on abolitionism. One of the things that Garrison also did was he started to advocate the North seceding from the South. Right? When we think of secession and somebody wanting a separate nation in the context of this period, we always think about the South. But Garrison thought the North should lead first. Right? So even before we actually get close to the times of secession, Garrison thought the North needed to rid itself of the South. In fact, he even felt that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And so he thought that the nation needed to be completely reconstituted. And that ultimately was where he parted ways with Frederick Douglass. Because Douglass originally felt the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, but in his later years felt that it could be used to support a free nation. And so some of the positive things that Douglass said about the Constitution set him at odds with Garrison, and the two parted ways and never reconciled. In 1854, actually on July 4th, Garrison is giving a speech, and he sets a copy of the Constitution on fire. And he calls it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Garrison would continue writing, continue being an abolitionist through the Civil War, and published his last copy of the Liberator in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. There are quite a few other people that we could talk about in the context of abolitionism. These are not the only people. These are perhaps the names that are most familiar. And I bring them up because of their different backgrounds, their different approaches, just kind of give us a wide view of where this attention to abolition is coming from. And really, during her time, one of the most famous abolitionists was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She came from a family in Massachusetts, in New England, who was very active in the abolitionist cause. Her father and brother were both famous New England preachers at the time. In fact, a biography of her brother published just a few years ago was called The Most Famous Man in America. Henry Ward Beecher was very prominent in antebellum New England, as well as after the Civil War, but also connected with abolition. In fact, her husband would be active as well. The way that Stowe is remembered is for her writing, and her major work for abolitionism was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book presents us with a variety of characters, but the focus is on Uncle Tom. Right? There's runaway slaves, there's a young daughter of a slaveholder, but Uncle Tom is the main focus. Now, although the term Uncle Tom will eventually be used in a pejorative way in the latter part during the Jim Crow and some other things in the latter part of the 19th century, ultimately the character of Uncle Tom is a very strong slave who, when the book starts, has a kind master who, through the first part, is kind of becoming ambivalent towards slavery. Right? His daughter is really kind of pushing him with Christianity and with some other things to reconsider what he's participating in as a slave master. He can't quite give up the Constitution, or not Constitution, the institution of slavery. But she really works on him, and so he's becoming more and more concerned that there's something morally wrong with slavery. But unfortunately, he dies before he frees Tom and the other slaves. And eventually Tom is sold to another master who's much harsher, who eventually beats him to death undeservedly. The book sold 300,000 copies before the Civil War. And so that, at the time we're talking about, that is a best-selling book. And really, it's important because for a lot of Northerners in the 19th century, they knew next to nothing about slavery other than it existed and it was in the South. But Uncle Tom's Cabin put a face, a human face, on slavery for a lot of Northerners. Now, it was stereotypical in a lot of ways. Right? It was caricature of the conditions and the people, but it really made real for a lot of Northerners some of the difficulties of slavery. And that's kind of evidenced in an alleged story about when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House. Now, Lincoln did meet Stowe, but there's a lot of, it's not clear exactly what all they talked about, but in later years, it was rumored that Lincoln said upon meeting Stowe, "So this is the little lady who wrote the book that caused this great war." Now, it's unclear whether Lincoln actually said that or not. But that does reflect the attitude of a lot of people that Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of galvanized people and to thinking about how horrible this is for a moral type of standpoint. What questions do you have about abolitionism? What do I need to maybe clarify or go into a little more detail about?